Marcus Thompson never imagined that wearing his grandfather's watch to school would lead to police officers standing at attention in front of him, saluting with the kind of respect reserved for military heroes. But that's exactly what happened on a cold Tuesday morning in March, when Mrs. Patricia Hartwell, his 11th grade history teacher, decided that a quiet 16-year-old boy like him couldn't possibly own a genuine Rolex. The moment she spotted the gleaming timepiece on his wrist during her lecture about World War II, her eyes narrowed with immediate suspicion and barely concealed contempt. Without a single question, without giving him even the slightest opportunity to explain, she stopped her lesson mid-sentence and announced to the entire class that Marcus was either wearing a pathetic fake or had stolen something far beyond his means. The humiliation that followed was designed to be absolute and crushing, a public spectacle meant to put him in what she considered his proper place. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're listening to this story from. I want to know how far it has reached. Mrs. Hartwell had always looked at Marcus with a particular kind of disdain that went beyond normal teacher-student dynamics. She taught at Boston Memorial High School, a public institution where students came from wildly different backgrounds, and she had developed a reputation for playing favorites based on superficial judgments about wealth, status, and appearance. Marcus, with his quiet demeanor, his worn backpack, and his habit of keeping to himself, represented everything she had decided wasn't worth her respect. He never raised his hand to show off his knowledge, even though his grades were impeccable. He never wore designer clothes or talked about expensive vacations. He rode the city bus to school every morning and brought homemade lunches in simple paper bags. In her narrow and prejudiced view of the world, boys like Marcus existed in a category she had mentally labeled as unremarkable, forgettable, and certainly not worthy of owning luxury items. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, because Marcus had never felt the need to broadcast it, was that his last name carried weight in circles far more important than her small-minded social hierarchies. The watch on his wrist wasn't just any Rolex. It was a 1953 Submariner, one of the earliest models ever produced, with a case back engraved with a military insignia and a serial number that connected it directly to his grandfather, General William Marcus Thompson. The general had worn that watch through 2 wars, through countless missions that remained classified even decades later, through moments of triumph and devastating loss. When he passed away 8 months earlier, he left specific instructions in his will that the watch should go to his grandson, the boy who carried his name and, according to the general's own words, his spirit of quiet strength and unwavering integrity. Marcus wore it not as a status symbol, but as a connection to the man who had raised him to value character over appearances, substance over flash, and honor over pride. Every time he glanced at the worn leather strap and the scratched crystal face, he remembered his grandfather's lessons about humility, about letting your actions speak louder than your words, about never needing to prove yourself to people who had already decided not to see your worth. Marcus had transferred to Boston Memorial High School at the beginning of his sophomore year, following his mother's job relocation to the city. From his very first day, he made a conscious decision to keep his family background private, not out of shame but out of a desire to be seen for who he was, rather than for his grandfather's legendary military career. He had attended military academy functions his entire childhood, had stood beside his grandfather during medal ceremonies, where generals and senators shook the old man's hand with reverence, had watched presidents honor his grandfather's service with words that seemed inadequate for the sacrifices made. But Marcus had also seen how people changed when they learned about his connection to General Thompson, how suddenly their interest in him shifted from genuine to opportunistic, how conversations became performances designed to curry favor or gain access to his grandfather's influence. So when he arrived at his new school, he introduced himself simply as Marcus, the quiet kid who liked history and mathematics, who played chess in the library during lunch, and who never caused trouble for anyone. Mrs. Hartwell had been teaching at Boston Memorial for 23 years, and in that time, she had developed a very specific worldview about her students based almost entirely on their economic backgrounds and social presentation. She reserved her warmth, her patience, and her genuine investment for students who came from what she considered good families, which in her estimation meant families with money, with connections, with the right last names that appeared on country club rosters and charity gala guest lists. These were the students she wrote glowing recommendation letters for, the ones she stayed after school to tutor without being asked, the ones whose minor infractions she overlooked with understanding smiles. For everyone else, particularly students like Marcus, who seemed unremarkable in her superficial assessment, she maintained a cold professional distance that occasionally crossed into outright hostility. She had watched Marcus for over a year, and in her mind she had constructed a complete narrative about him based on nothing more than his quiet nature and his modest appearance. The watch had been a recent addition to Marcus's daily attire. For the first 7 months after his grandfather's death, he had kept it safely locked in a wooden box at home, too precious and too painful to wear. But on what would have been the General's 80th birthday, Marcus made the decision to honor his grandfather's memory by wearing the watch every day, just as the old man had done. He knew the Rolex would draw attention eventually, knew that someone would notice and ask questions, but he had underestimated how quickly those questions would turn into accusations. He had foolishly believed that in a school environment, among educated people, he would at least be given the benefit of the doubt, would at least be asked for an explanation before being condemned. Mrs. Hartwell's reaction to seeing the watch was immediate and visceral. She had been mid-sentence, discussing the strategic decisions made during the Battle of the Bulge, when the winter sunlight streaming through the classroom windows caught the crystal face of Marcus's watch and sent a brief flash of light across the room. Her eyes tracked the source of that gleam, landed on Marcus's wrist, and her entire expression transformed from professional educator to suspicious interrogator in the span of a single heartbeat. The Rolex Submariner, even worn and aged, was unmistakable to anyone with even passing knowledge of luxury watches, and Mrs. Hartwell prided herself on recognizing quality items even if she couldn't afford most of them herself. What happened next would later be described by the 30 other students in that classroom as one of the most uncomfortable and unjust moments they had ever witnessed in their academic careers. Mrs. Hartwell walked directly to Marcus's desk with purposeful strides that echoed in the suddenly silent room, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor like a countdown to inevitable confrontation. She stood over him, her shadow falling across his notebook, where he had been carefully transcribing her lecture notes, and demanded that he remove the watch immediately and explain where he had gotten such an obviously expensive item. Marcus felt his face flush hot with embarrassment as every single pair of eyes in the classroom turned toward him. 30 of his classmates suddenly transformed into an audience for his humiliation. He tried to explain calmly that the watch had belonged to his grandfather, that it was a family heirloom given to him after his grandfather's passing, that it held tremendous sentimental value beyond its monetary worth. But Mrs. Hartwell cut him off before he could finish even his first sentence, her voice dripping with skepticism and barely disguised contempt as she declared that she found his story highly unlikely and completely unconvincing. She informed him, loud enough for everyone to hear, that she had taught long enough to recognize when a student was lying, and that boys from his background simply did not inherit genuine Rolex watches from their grandfathers. The way she emphasized the words "his background" left no room for misinterpretation about what she really meant, about the assumptions she had made based on nothing more than his quiet demeanor and his lack of designer clothing. The other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking down at their desks to avoid being part of this cruel spectacle, others whispering to each other with expressions that ranged from shock to second-hand embarrassment. Marcus's closest friend in the class, a girl named Jennifer, who sat 2 rows behind him, later told investigators that she had wanted to speak up in his defense, but felt paralyzed by the authority Mrs. Hartwell wielded in that moment, and by the fear of becoming her next target. Marcus himself remained remarkably composed, despite the rage and hurt burning in his chest, despite the urge to raise his voice and demand the respect he deserved. He had been raised by his grandfather to maintain dignity even in the face of injustice, to never let someone else's ignorance or prejudice reduce him to reactive anger. So instead of arguing, instead of making a scene, he quietly removed the watch from his wrist as Mrs. Hartwell had demanded, and placed it on his desk, his hands steady even though his heart was pounding. Mrs. Hartwell picked up the watch with 2 fingers as if it might contaminate her, holding it up to the light and examining it with exaggerated scrutiny. She announced to the class that while the watch certainly looked authentic at first glance, there was a thriving market for convincing counterfeits, and that she had serious doubts about its legitimacy. But even if it were somehow genuine, she continued, her voice taking on an even more accusatory tone, then Marcus needed to explain how he had come into possession of such a valuable item, because the alternative explanations were deeply troubling. She let that implication hang in the air like poisonous smoke, allowing every student in the room to understand exactly what she was suggesting without saying the word theft directly. Marcus felt something crack inside him at that moment, not breaking completely but fracturing enough that he knew things would never be quite the same. Between him and this institution that was supposed to educate and protect him. Without asking Marcus for any additional explanation, without giving him any opportunity to prove the watch's provenance or his legitimate ownership, Mrs. Hartwell walked to her desk and picked up the phone that connected directly to the main office. She requested that security come to her classroom immediately because she had a situation that required their intervention and possibly police involvement. The words police involvement sent a ripple of shocked murmurs through the classroom, and Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized just how far she was willing to take her baseless accusations. He thought about his mother receiving a call that her son had been accused of theft, thought about how his grandfather would have felt, knowing that his precious gift had become the instrument of Marcus's public shaming. Within 5 minutes, 2 SU security officers arrived at the classroom door, their expressions serious and alert, as Mrs. Hartwell explained her concerns in a voice that managed to sound both worried and vindicated. She told them that Marcus had been wearing what appeared to be a very expensive Rolex watch, that his explanation for how he obtained it was suspicious and unconvincing, and that she felt it was her duty as an educator and as a responsible member of the school community to report what she believed might be stolen property. She handed them the watch still in her possession, emphasizing again her doubts about either its authenticity or the legitimacy of Marcus's ownership. The security officers, both of whom had known Marcus for over a year as one of the most well-behaved and respectful students in the entire school, exchanged glances that suggested they found Mrs. Hartwell's dramatic accusations somewhat excessive. The older of the 2 officers, a man named Mr. Davis, who had worked at Boston Memorial for nearly 15 years, asked Marcus if he had any documentation or proof of ownership for the watch. Marcus explained again, his voice steady despite the humiliation of having to defend himself against charges that should never have been brought in the first place, that the watch had belonged to his late grandfather and had been bequeathed to him through a properly executed will. He offered to call his mother to provide copies of the will, to show them photographs of his grandfather wearing the exact same watch during his military service. But Mrs. Hartwell interrupted before the security officers could respond, insisting that such documentation could easily be fabricated and that the proper course of action was to involve the actual police department to verify the watch's origin through their databases of stolen property. Mr. Davis seemed reluctant to escalate the situation to that level, recognizing perhaps that bringing police into a school over a student's wristwatch could have serious and lasting consequences for everyone involved. But Mrs. Hartwell was insistent, her voice rising with indignation as she questioned whether the security staff was really willing to ignore what she characterized as obvious evidence of either fraud or theft. She reminded them that the school had a zero-tolerance policy for stolen property, and that failing to investigate thoroughly could expose the institution to liability if it later turned out that Marcus had indeed obtained the watch through illicit means. Her arguments, delivered with the conviction of someone who believed absolutely in her own moral superiority and her right to judge others, eventually wore down the security officers' resistance. Mr. Davis made the call to the Boston Police Department, requesting that an officer be sent to the school to investigate a potential theft situation involving a student and a high-value watch. Marcus sat at his desk throughout this entire exchange, his hands folded in front of him, his expression carefully neutral, even though inside he felt a mixture of anger, humiliation, and something approaching disbelief that this was actually happening to him. Some of his classmates tried to catch his eye with sympathetic looks, while others seemed almost excited by the drama unfolding in their normally mundane history class. Mrs. Hartwell returned to her desk and made a show of organizing papers, her body language suggesting satisfaction with how she had handled what she clearly viewed as a dangerous situation. She had done her duty, she had protected the school, she had refused to be fooled by a smooth-talking student with a convenient story. In her mind, she was the hero of this narrative, the vigilant educator who saw through deception where others might have been too naive or too permissive. The wait for the police to arrive felt interminable, 25 minutes during which Mrs. Hartwell attempted to resume her lesson, but could barely maintain the attention of students who were far more interested in the real-life drama than in historical battles fought decades ago. Marcus remained silent, answering only when directly addressed by the security officers, refusing to give Mrs. Hartwell the satisfaction of seeing him rattled or defensive. He thought about his grandfather, about the countless times the general had faced far more serious accusations and challenges during his military career, about how the old man had always maintained his composure and trusted that truth would eventually prevail over prejudice and assumption. When Officer James Mitchell finally walked through the classroom door, his uniform crisp and his expression professionally neutral, the room fell into absolute silence. He was a veteran officer with nearly 20 years of service in the Boston Police Department, a man who had seen every possible variation of school-related incidents, from genuine crimes to overblown misunderstandings. Mrs. Hartwell immediately approached him with the watch, launching into her explanation before he had even fully entered the room, her words tumbling out in a rush as she described her suspicions and her certainty that something inappropriate had occurred. Officer Mitchell listened to Mrs. Hartwell's lengthy explanation with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to dealing with civilians who were absolutely convinced of their own correctness. He took the watch from her hands carefully, examining it with the kind of attention that suggested he actually knew something about luxury timepieces and their distinguishing features. His eyes traced the worn leather strap, the scratched crystal that spoke of decades of daily wear, the subtle patina on the stainless steel case that could not be replicated by even the most sophisticated counterfeiters. Then his gaze shifted to the case back, and Marcus noticed the exact moment when the officer's entire demeanor changed, when his professional neutrality gave way to something that looked remarkably like recognition and possibly even surprise. Officer Mitchell turned the watch over in his hands, studying an engraving that Marcus knew by heart, the military insignia of the United States Army Special Forces, and a serial number that connected the timepiece directly to his grandfather's service record. The officer looked up from the watch and directly at Marcus, his eyes sharp and assessing, in a way that was completely different from Mrs. Hartwell's contemptuous scrutiny. He asked Marcus a simple question, inquiring about his full name and whether he had any relation to General William Marcus Thompson. The moment Marcus confirmed that the general had been his grandfather, that he had passed away 8 months prior, and that the watch had been specifically bequeathed to him as a family heirloom, Officer Mitchell's expression shifted into something that looked like a mixture of respect and carefully controlled anger at the situation he had been called to investigate. The officer explained, his voice carrying clearly through the silent classroom, that he had served in the army before joining the police force, and that General Thompson's name was legendary among anyone who had ever worn a military uniform. He described how the general's tactical innovations had saved countless lives, how his leadership during some of the most dangerous operations in modern military history had earned him every major commendation the United States could bestow, and how his legacy was still taught at West Point and other military academies as an example of exemplary service. Mrs. Hartwell's face had gone progressively paler during Officer Mitchell's explanation, the blood draining from her cheeks as she began to realize the magnitude of her mistake. She attempted to interrupt, to explain that she had only been trying to protect the school and its students, but Officer Mitchell held up his hand for silence in a gesture that carried unmistakable authority. He continued speaking, addressing not just Marcus but the entire classroom, explaining that the watch Marcus wore was not just valuable in monetary terms, but was a piece of American military history, a symbol of sacrifice and service that deserved reverence rather than suspicion. He stated that the engraving on the caseback was authentic and matched military records that could be easily verified, and that anyone familiar with General Thompson's service would recognize the significance of the serial number and insignia. Then Officer Mitchell did something that no one in that classroom, least of all Mrs. Hartwell, could have anticipated. He turned to face Marcus fully, brought his heels together with a sharp click, and raised his right hand to his forehead in a crisp military salute. The gesture was executed with perfect precision, held for 3 full seconds, a sign of profound respect from one service member to the grandson of a fallen hero. Marcus, who had grown up around military protocol, instinctively rose from his desk and returned the salute. His movements equally precise, his bearing suddenly transformed from embarrassed student to the descendant of a military dynasty. The silence in the classroom was so complete that students later reported being able to hear their own heartbeats, the moment stretching into something almost sacred, as everyone present realized they were witnessing not a criminal investigation, but an honoring of sacrifice and legacy. Officer Mitchell lowered his salute and carefully, almost reverently, handed the watch back to Marcus, telling him that his grandfather would be proud of how he had conducted himself with dignity during this unfortunate misunderstanding. He emphasized the word misunderstanding with enough weight that it was clear he considered Mrs. Hartwell's actions to be far worse than a simple error in judgment. The officer then turned to Mrs. Hartwell, his expression no longer neutral but cold with professional disapproval, and informed her that not only was the watch completely legitimate and properly owned, but that her accusations against a student without any actual evidence or proper investigation constituted a serious lapse in judgment that he would be documenting in his official report. The atmosphere in the classroom had completely inverted in the span of those few minutes, the power dynamics shifting so dramatically that even students who had been only half paying attention now sat in rapt attention, witnessing their teacher's public unraveling. Mrs. Hartwell attempted to salvage the situation with stammering explanations about her duty to be vigilant, about the prevalence of theft in schools, about how she could not have possibly known about Marcus's family background since he had never mentioned it. But each word she spoke only seemed to dig her hole deeper, her excuses sounding increasingly hollow and desperate in the wake of Officer Mitchell's revelation. The officer listened to her with barely concealed impatience, his arms crossed over his chest, in a posture that communicated his complete lack of sympathy for her position. He pointed out, his voice sharp with criticism, that proper protocol when a teacher suspects a student of wrongdoing is to investigate privately and discreetly, not to publicly humiliate the student in front of their peers based on nothing more than assumptions about what they could or could not afford. Officer Mitchell informed Mrs. Hartwell that he would be filing a complete report of the incident, including her accusations, her refusal to allow Marcus to explain, and her insistence on involving law enforcement despite the security officer's initial hesitation. He made it clear that such a report would be reviewed by both the school administration and the police department's school liaison division, and that there would likely be questions about whether her actions constituted discrimination or prejudicial treatment of a student. The word discrimination seemed to hit Mrs. Hartwell like a physical blow, her eyes widening with the realization that this incident could have serious professional consequences for her career. She tried to protest that she had treated Marcus exactly as she would treat any student in the same situation, but Officer Mitchell countered by asking her pointedly whether she had ever called the police on the students from wealthy families who regularly wore expensive jewelry and designer accessories to school, whether she had subjected them to the same level of scrutiny and public accusation. The officer's question hung in the air unanswered because everyone in that room, including Mrs. Hartwell herself, knew the truth. She had never questioned the expensive items worn by students whose families were well known in the community, had never demanded proof of ownership from the students who drove luxury cars to school or carried designer handbags worth thousands of dollars. Her selective vigilance had been reserved exclusively for students like Marcus, students she had prejudged as unworthy of possessing anything of value. Officer Mitchell told Marcus that he was free to leave the classroom if he wished, that no further investigation was needed, and that he should contact the police department directly if he experienced any retaliation or continued harassment related to this incident. He also made a point of saying, loud enough for everyone to hear, that Marcus had conducted himself with remarkable maturity and restraint during an experience that would have caused many people to react with justifiable anger. Marcus quietly gathered his belongings, fastened his grandfather's watch back onto his wrist with hands that trembled slightly from the adrenaline finally catching up to him, and walked toward the classroom door. As he passed Mrs. Hartwell's desk, he paused for just a moment, not to gloat or to add to her humiliation, but to look her directly in the eyes with an expression of profound disappointment. He did not say a word, did not need to, because his silence communicated more powerfully than any angry speech could have. He had given her the opportunity to know him as a person, had been a model student in her class for over a year, and she had repaid his quiet excellence with contempt and public accusations. That moment of eye contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but several students later reported that it was one of the most powerful non-verbal communications they had ever witnessed. The news of what had happened in Mrs. Hartwell's history class spread through Boston Memorial High School with the speed that only high school gossip can achieve, every student seemingly hearing some version of the story before the lunch period had ended. The details became slightly exaggerated in some tellings, with students claiming that multiple police officers had saluted Marcus, or that Mrs. Hartwell had actually been arrested on the spot, but the core facts remained consistent and damning. A teacher had publicly accused a quiet, well-behaved student of either possessing a fake watch or having stolen a real one, had called the police to investigate, and had been spectacularly proven wrong when it turned out the student was the grandson of a decorated military hero. By the end of that school day, the story had reached the principal's office not through official channels, but through the concerned phone calls of parents who had heard about the incident from their children and were demanding to know what kind of environment the school was fostering. Principal Robert Henderson, a career educator who prided himself on running a fair and inclusive institution, found himself fielding calls from angry parents, questions from concerned teachers, and eventually a formal inquiry from the school district's central administration. He requested copies of Officer Mitchell's report, interviewed the security officers who had been present, and spoke with several students from Mrs. Hartwell's class who volunteered detailed accounts of exactly what had transpired. What emerged from these multiple sources was a consistent and troubling picture of a teacher who had allowed her personal biases to override her professional judgment and had subjected a student to unwarranted humiliation based on nothing more than her assumptions about his socio-economic background. Principal Henderson called an emergency meeting with Mrs. Hartwell in his office that same afternoon, and though the details of that conversation remained officially confidential, staff members reported hearing raised voices and seeing Mrs. Hartwell emerge from the meeting with red-rimmed eyes and a pale, shaken expression. The principal subsequently contacted Marcus's mother, Dr. Sarah Thompson, a respected physician at Massachusetts General Hospital, to personally apologize for the incident and to assure her that the school would be conducting a thorough investigation into Mrs. Hartwell's conduct. Dr. Thompson, who had deliberately kept her family's military background private to allow her son a normal school experience, was gracious in her response, but made it clear that she expected concrete actions to ensure that no other student would be subjected to similar treatment. She mentioned almost casually that several parents from military families had already reached out to her expressing their concerns about potential bias in the school's treatment of students from non-wealthy backgrounds. The investigation that followed was swift and comprehensive, conducted by a district-level administrator who interviewed dozens of current and former students about their experiences in Mrs. Hartwell's classes. What emerged was a disturbing pattern of favoritism and discriminatory treatment that had gone unreported for years because students felt powerless to challenge a teacher with 2 decades of seniority. Multiple students came forward with stories of being dismissed, belittled, or graded more harshly than their wealthier peers for identical work. Some described how Mrs. Hartwell would spend extra time helping students from prominent families, while barely acknowledging questions from scholarship students or those from working-class backgrounds. Others recounted incidents where she had made assumptions about students' academic potential based entirely on their clothing, their addresses, or their parents' professions. The investigation revealed that the incident with Marcus was not an isolated overreaction, but rather the most dramatic manifestation of a long-standing pattern of prejudicial behavior. Within 2 weeks of the incident, the school district announced that Mrs. Hartwell was being placed on administrative leave pending the completion of the investigation. The official statement cited concerns about classroom management and adherence to district policies regarding student dignity and equal treatment. Mrs. Hartwell attempted to defend herself through her union representative, arguing that she had been a dedicated teacher for over 2 decades and that one mistake should not define her entire career. But the evidence compiled by the investigation was overwhelming, documenting not one mistake, but a systematic pattern of behavior that violated both district policy and basic principles of educational equity. Several parents whose children had been negatively impacted by her teaching demanded her immediate dismissal, while others argued for mandatory retraining and close supervision if she were to be allowed to return to the classroom. Marcus himself was careful not to participate in the public discussion about Mrs. Hartwell's fate, declining interview requests from local news outlets that had picked up the story and refusing to join social media campaigns calling for her termination. His mother had taught him that dignity meant taking the high road even when others had gone low, and his grandfather had always emphasized that true strength was shown through restraint rather than retaliation. But his silence on the matter did not mean he was unaffected by what had happened, or that he believed there should be no consequences for Mrs. Hartwell's actions. He simply trusted that the truth, now fully exposed, would lead to appropriate accountability, without requiring him to personally seek vengeance or publicly shame the woman who had tried to shame him. The school board held a hearing 3 weeks after the incident, a formal proceeding that was technically closed to the public, but whose details inevitably leaked through the multiple parties involved. Mrs. Hartwell attended with her union representative and a private attorney, prepared to argue that while her judgment may have been flawed in this particular instance, she deserved another chance after her years of service to the district. But the evidence presented by the district's investigator was damning and extensive, including written statements from 17 different students spanning 5 years, all describing instances of discriminatory treatment or inappropriate assumptions based on their economic backgrounds. The investigator presented email records showing that Mrs. Hartwell had recommended students for advanced placement courses and scholarship opportunities based not on their academic performance, but on her personal assessment of their family circumstances and social connections. There were grade distributions showing statistically significant disparities between how she scored students from wealthy families versus those from modest backgrounds, even when the work submitted was objectively of similar quality. The board members listened to testimony from students who described the lasting impact of Mrs. Hartwell's treatment, including one young woman who had nearly dropped out of the honors program because Mrs. Hartwell repeatedly told her that she was in over her head and should focus on more practical career paths instead of pursuing her college ambitions. That student, now a sophomore at MIT on a full scholarship, spoke eloquently about how Mrs. Hartwell's low expectations could have derailed her entire future if she had not had other teachers who believed in her potential. Another former student described being told in front of his entire class that students from his neighborhood rarely succeeded in advanced mathematics, a comment that had shaken his confidence so severely that he required counseling to overcome the psychological damage. The cumulative weight of these testimonies painted a picture of an educator who had systematically used her position of authority to reinforce social hierarchies and limit opportunities for students she deemed unworthy based on criteria having nothing to do with their actual abilities or character. Officer Mitchell submitted a supplementary statement to the board describing his observations during the incident with Marcus, noting that Mrs. Hartwell had shown no interest in gathering facts before making serious accusations and had demonstrated what he characterized as clear prejudicial assumptions. His statement carried particular weight given his years of experience in law enforcement and his training in recognizing discriminatory behavior. He pointed out that calling police to a school to investigate a student wearing an expensive watch, without any actual evidence of theft or wrongdoing, represented a misuse of law enforcement resources and subjected the student to potential criminal justice involvement based solely on the teacher's biased assumptions. He noted that such actions, if allowed to continue unchecked, could contribute to the troubling pattern of students from certain backgrounds being unnecessarily criminalized for behaviors that would not raise suspicion if performed by their wealthier peers. The school board deliberated for less than 2 hours before reaching their decision. Mrs. Patricia Hartwell would be terminated from her position at Boston Memorial High School, effective immediately, with the termination being classified as for cause, meaning she would not be eligible for severance pay beyond her accrued vacation time and would face significant challenges if she attempted to secure another teaching position elsewhere. The board's written decision stated that her pattern of discriminatory behavior, her misuse of authority, her failure to treat students with equal dignity and respect, and her poor judgment in the incident involving Marcus Thompson all constituted serious violations of the district's code of conduct and represented a fundamental betrayal of the trust placed in educators. They noted that while teachers were entitled to make honest mistakes and to grow from their errors, Mrs. Hartwell's conduct reflected not occasional lapses but deeply embedded biases that she had shown no genuine willingness to examine or correct. The news of Mrs. Hartwell's termination spread through Boston Memorial High School with the same speed as the original incident had, but this time the reaction was more complex and divided. Some students and parents felt that the punishment was appropriate and necessary, a clear message that discrimination would not be tolerated regardless of a teacher's seniority or previous reputation. Others worried that the publicity surrounding the case might make all teachers more hesitant to address genuine concerns about student behavior, out of fear that they might be accused of bias. A few of Mrs. Hartwell's colleagues defended her privately, suggesting that she had been made a scapegoat for systemic problems that existed throughout the education system, though notably, none of them were willing to make such statements publicly or on the record. Marcus returned to his regular classes the Monday, following the school board's decision. Walking through hallways where students now looked at him with a mixture of respect, curiosity, and a certain careful distance that came from his newfound status as someone whose quiet exterior concealed a family legacy of genuine significance. Some students who had never spoken to him before suddenly wanted to be his friend, wanted to hear stories about his grandfather, wanted to be associated with someone who had become something of a legend within the school. But Marcus handled this attention with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout the entire ordeal, politely declining to discuss his grandfather's military career in detail and gently redirecting conversations away from the incident with Mrs. Hartwell. He had no interest in being defined by what had happened to him or by his family name, preferring instead to let his own character and actions speak for who he was as an individual. The school administration assigned a substitute teacher to take over Mrs. Hartwell's history classes for the remainder of the semester, a young educator named Mr. Williams, who made a point during his first day to establish that his classroom would be a place where every student was valued equally and where assumptions would never replace actual knowledge of individual circumstances. Marcus appreciated the gesture, though he noticed that Mr. Williams seemed almost nervous around him, as if afraid of making any mistake that might be interpreted as insensitive, given what had happened with his predecessor. It took several weeks for their relationship to normalize into something resembling a typical student-teacher dynamic, but eventually Mr. Williams relaxed enough to challenge Marcus academically and to treat him as he treated every other student, which was exactly what Marcus had wanted all along. In the months that followed, Marcus became quietly involved in a student-led initiative to create a more inclusive environment at Boston Memorial, working with the principal and a faculty committee to develop clearer policies about addressing bias and ensuring equal treatment for all students regardless of their backgrounds. He did not seek a leadership role in these discussions, preferring instead to contribute his perspective when asked and to support other students who had their own stories of being judged unfairly based on superficial characteristics. His involvement was characteristic of his overall approach to life, the same approach his grandfather had modeled throughout a distinguished military career. Lead by example, speak truth without arrogance, and work to improve systems rather than simply complaining about their flaws. The policies that emerged from these discussions included mandatory training for all teachers on recognizing and addressing implicit bias, clearer procedures for handling disciplinary situations to prevent escalation based on assumptions, and the creation of a student advisory committee that would provide feedback on school climate issues. Mrs. Hartwell's fate after her termination became the subject of occasional speculation among students and staff, though concrete information was difficult to obtain. Some heard that she had filed a grievance through her union, challenging the termination, though whether that grievance had any merit or chance of success remained unclear. Others reported seeing her at a coffee shop in a neighboring town, looking diminished and aged, the confident authority she had projected in the classroom completely absent from her demeanor. A few of her former colleagues maintained limited contact with her and reported that she was struggling to come to terms with how her career had ended, oscillating between anger at what she perceived as an overreaction to a single mistake and moments of genuine reflection about whether her treatment of students had indeed been as biased as the investigation had found. But for most people at Boston Memorial, including Marcus, she became simply a cautionary tale, a reminder of how unchecked prejudice and the misuse of authority could destroy both a career and the trust that made education possible. Marcus wore his grandfather's watch every day without exception, and gradually it stopped being a topic of conversation or curiosity among his classmates. It became simply a part of who he was, unremarkable in its familiarity, though he occasionally caught students glancing at it when they thought he was not looking, perhaps remembering the story of how a teacher's assumptions had been so spectacularly proven wrong. He never attempted to hide the watch or to minimize its significance, but neither did he use it as a conversation starter or a way to establish his credentials. It remained what it had always been intended to be, a private connection to a man he had loved and admired, a reminder of values that transcended material worth, and a symbol of the quiet strength that came from knowing who you were, regardless of what others assumed about you. As Marcus approached the end of his junior year and began thinking seriously about college applications and his future beyond Boston Memorial High School, he found himself reflecting on how profoundly the incident with Mrs. Hartwell had shaped his understanding of both human nature and institutional responsibility. The experience had stripped away certain naive assumptions he had held about the inherent fairness of educational systems and the automatic trustworthiness of authority figures, replacing them with a more nuanced understanding that good institutions required constant vigilance and that respect had to be earned through actions rather than simply demanded through position. He had learned that silence and humility, while admirable qualities his grandfather had instilled in him, could sometimes be misinterpreted as weakness or as evidence of having something to hide, and that there were moments when speaking up about one's truth was not arrogance, but necessary self-advocacy. These lessons, painful as they had been to learn, gave him a depth of character and a clarity of purpose that many of his peers would not develop until much later in life. His mother noticed the change in him during their dinner conversations, the way he spoke with increased confidence about his college plans and his desire to study either military history or education policy, fields where he could contribute to ensuring that future generations learned both from the sacrifices of heroes like his grandfather and from the mistakes of institutions that failed to protect all students equally. Dr. Thompson had worried initially that the incident might damage her son's trust in education itself or leave him bitter and cynical about human nature, but instead she watched him channel the experience into motivation for positive change. He told her one evening that he finally understood something his grandfather had tried to teach him years earlier, that being treated unjustly was not a reflection of your worth, but rather a test of your character, and that the measure of a person was not whether they faced adversity, but how they responded to it with integrity intact. Marcus graduated from Boston Memorial High School the following year, with highest honors, having been named valedictorian of his class based on his exceptional academic record and his contributions to improving school culture. His valedictorian speech delivered to a packed auditorium that included his mother, several of his grandfather's former military colleagues who had traveled to honor his achievement, and even Officer Mitchell, who had attended out of respect, carefully avoided any direct reference to the incident with Mrs. Hartwell. Instead, he spoke eloquently about the importance of seeing beyond surface appearances, of giving people the opportunity to reveal their true character through their actions rather than judging them based on assumptions, and of the responsibility that came with privilege or authority to use it in service of justice rather than in reinforcement of prejudice. The audience listened in rapt silence, and when he finished, the standing ovation lasted nearly 3 minutes, with many people in attendance recognizing the personal experience that informed his words, even though he had been gracious enough not to make the speech about his own vindication. Officer Mitchell approached Marcus after the ceremony, shaking his hand with genuine warmth and telling him that his grandfather would have been extraordinarily proud, not just of his academic achievements, but of the young man he had become. The officer mentioned that he had kept the official report from that day in his desk as a reminder that doing the right thing sometimes meant challenging the assumptions of people in positions of authority, and that Marcus's dignified response to injustice had reinforced his own commitment to treating every person he encountered with fairness, regardless of their age or appearance. They spoke for several minutes about General Thompson's legacy, about the challenges of maintaining integrity in institutions that sometimes valued conformity over justice, and about the officer's hope that Marcus would continue to be a voice for equity wherever his future took him. In the years that followed, as Marcus went on to attend West Point following in his grandfather's footsteps, he would occasionally think back to that March morning when Mrs. Hartwell had called the police over his watch, and he would recognize it as one of those defining moments that revealed both the worst and best of human nature. The worst was represented by a teacher who had allowed her biases to override her professional obligations and her basic human decency, who had been so convinced of her own rightness that she had subjected a student to public humiliation without evidence or investigation. But the best was represented by Officer Mitchell's immediate recognition of what the watch truly meant, and his willingness to honor that significance with a salute that transformed a moment of injustice into a moment of profound respect by the students who had spoken up during the investigation despite their fear of authority, by the administrators who had conducted a thorough and fair inquiry rather than protecting institutional reputation at the expense of truth, and by his own choice to respond with dignity rather than with bitterness or revenge. The watch on his wrist, still keeping perfect time after all those years, remained a constant reminder that true value was never determined by others' perceptions, but by the character, sacrifice, and integrity that no amount of prejudice could diminish or take away.